Hi, welcome to Module 1 of Gender Diversity and Society class, BA 220. I thought I would add a short lecture for each of our modules to sort of bring out the important points within each of the chapters in the reading. The book that we're using in this course does a really great job of framing the issue, and in particular in the first couple of chapters that we're reading this module, it brings in an historical perspective as well as bringing us up to date and giving us a really good overview of some of the issues at hand today. So if we look back, the textbook begins by discussing the fact that the United States is a land of immigrants and that it continues to that people continue to migrate to this country, especially since the 1960s. And the text goes into some explanation as to why that is. But really, we want to focus in on this concept of minority groups, and we probably should start out by defining that. And there are a couple of key points that we use, and these have been formulated by a number of scholars in the field and capsulized within your textbook in a really easy to understand manner. So typically a minority group has some sort of disadvantage or an inequality that it experiences, and there is something that is visible to the dominant group that identifies people as a member of that minority group, and the minority group itself does share some commonalities. So the most important characteristic of minority groups is the fact that there is an inequality in their existence within society, and that there are some patterns that can be determined, but it's typically a result of the actions of the dominant group in a society and how it views the minority group and acts towards them, and the reasons behind that are something that we'll explore in just a little bit. So one of the things we find in our reading is that minority groups have different inequalities, but typically the one thing that they will share is a lack of access to wealth and income, prestige, and power, and that this stratification means that we actually have different social classes within our society, and it has a lot to do with the different minority groups and their status within our society. So if we look at some of the distinguishing traits that we see, some minority groups are defined by race, in which we can see some physical characteristics. Ethnic groups tend to be identified via their cultural characteristics, and we have a variety of minority groups, and people can be members of more than one minority group at the same time. That the formulation of these of minority status really comes from the history and social processes rather than what was thought many years or centuries ago, which was biological. So in terms of our culture and society here in the US, we have a very Western tradition because our original immigrants came from Western Europe, and so they were here first in terms of immigration and were able to establish a dominance and had an impact on any of those who followed afterwards. And they also, in Europe, which is where our biggest first wave came from, they colonized other areas of the world, and typically saw those other less developed areas as inferior, and that prejudice continued when they immigrated to our country, and it has sort of woven through our society and has a place even in today's thought processes. So most experts in this field look more at the social construction of race as opposed to biology, in that it's the history of various peoples, the economy and how it affects life and lifestyle and various political processes that really define the differences. And we see this played out more and more as we read through our text. Another minority, and it's actually part of the title of this course, has to do with gender. And oftentimes with gender, we classify people either in, as one gender, meaning that it's a homogeneous group, which of course it's not. And I mentioned earlier that people can be members of more than one minority group. So somebody could be, say, a female, which is a minority group in our society, but at the same time be a member of another minority group, such as a Pacific Islander or Asian American. So, and others. So we tend to want to look at gender not as a standalone category, but as it's melted in with other statuses in terms of minorities. One of the things that we're going to explore along the way are the concepts of prejudice and discrimination. So let's take a look at prejudice, which is really about our internal thoughts and feelings towards a group that we perceive to be different. So discrimination, as we'll discover later, is about acting on that. But the prejudice is having certain thoughts about a group in general, and oftentimes that includes a stereotype of certain generalizations about members of that group. And then having those specific thoughts about a group can often lead to negative emotions about that minority group. And so where does that come from? We think about our prejudice as coming from a number of conflicts and history, where waves of different groups have come in and fought to either to have a certain level of equality in their new home, whereas a dominant group in society feels threatened by these new immigrant groups and begins to fight for to ensure that they don't have a loss of those things we talked about a couple of minutes ago: wealth, power, prestige. And this socialization process of prejudice is something that becomes embedded in our society, and people are sometimes unaware that they have certain thoughts or feelings, and they are unaware that they are passing those on. And it's part of the acculturation of our society as new generations are born and children begin to adopt the values of their parents. So it's something that continues to self-perpetuate. In modern day times, there's been a lot of study on this topic recently, and also over the years, but there was, some thinking for a while that individual prejudice was no longer really that significant in American society, and yet in further research, what's really come about is the thinking among scholars and practitioners that it's more of a subtle and kind of indirect form of racism. And we'll see later that this can be at an individual level, but it can also be at a structural level. And so it's something that is less apparent on the surface, but still very much alive. So we want to take a look at that. As I mentioned, discrimination is really the behavior or actions that somebody would take towards a member of a minority group, and it's really acting on prejudice. And so we want to keep those two concepts somewhat separate, but knowing that they're interrelated. In terms of minority groups, particularly new immigrant groups coming into a society, there are two primary thoughts on how they become part of that society. One is assimilation and the other is pluralism. So in assimilation, the new minority group begins to take on characteristics of the dominant group, and so that they begin to merge in more socially. Pluralism, on the other hand, really encourages these new groups to maintain their original identities, their cultures, their practices, and live side by side so that we have various groups living, different culture and social groups living within the same society. So there are some traditional thoughts on assimilation, which was the primary theory until more recently. And we're going to refer back to some of these key path makers in terms of studies in this area. Robert Park is one of those, and he talks about the race relation cycle, and that something to think about, that over time, first there's contact, and then there's competition with that dominant group, and then accommodation begins to take place, and eventually assimilation, and this takes place over a number of generations. And the bottom line is that because in a society like ours that is a democracy, that eventually everyone will be equal under the law. And another theorist is Milton Gordon, and he actually took it a little bit further, and you can see these gentlemen came out of the 60s and differentiated between culture and social structure. And so that we have two different arenas in which assimilation can occur, but at different paces. The concept of pluralism was originally floated out by Horace Kallen and was originally rejected. And yet the concept of pluralism has increased in interest more recently because of the increasing pace at which we have immigration into this country from a variety of other areas in the world. Some of this has to do with technology and globalization and the shrinking of our world. And so this idea of groups coming to the U.S. and wanting to maintain their identity as well as being equal partners has led to this sort of rebirth of looking at the concept of pluralism. And this idea of multiculturalism, it continues to be something that is debated in our contemporary society. So I mentioned earlier that we can look at our minority groups, our new minority groups in particular, as from a couple of different vantage points, and one is culturally and the other is structurally. So culturally is about maintaining their identity or assimilating and adopting more of the cultural characteristics of the dominant group. In structural pluralism in particular, it occurs when a group has acculturated but not actually integrated. And so they have adopted many of the Anglo-American cultural characteristics, but maintain some separate identities structurally. And your book has used some really good examples of those. And a third way that we sometimes see pluralistic groups in society is where they integrate but don't acculturate. So it's kind of the reverse of the other two. And we see this in what are often called enclave groups, like in various large cities like San Francisco, maybe Chinatown, that kind of thing. And a few patterns of assimilation have been identified, and I mentioned earlier that it often takes a number of generations. And you can see here from this slide and from reading in your book that, you know, our first generation are really the immigrants, and themselves, and their second generation, which is often the generation that is pulled in two different directions, because they're the first generation who immigrated is still very much culturally tied to the original homeland, and the children are immersed in American schools and American society, and they're pulled in that direction. By the third generation, we often see more of this move towards embedding assimilation, and we begin to see intergroup marriages and that kind of thing, so that the assimilation pattern begins to take hold. And if we look at one of the causes of this conflict between minority groups and dominant groups, a lot has to do with the level of similarity with the dominant group. So some groups that immigrated, particularly those from Western Europe, were actually assimilated or accepted a little bit faster than those that came from cultures that were much more different or appeared different or had different cultural practices. And your book uses this as examples of different groups coming from different areas. And this dates back primarily in the very early 20th century, when the dominant group began to fear these new large groups of immigrants coming in, that their status in terms of wealth and power and prestige would be threatened, and carries forward today. So speaking of today, does this traditional perspective of assimilation still apply? And this is something that has been debated. And if we take a look at the examples as we read through our material in this course, we'll see that different minority groups have different assimilation patterns, and it'll be interesting to see how those take place. In other words, there is no one manner in which this occurs. So implications for our the dominant and minority relations, which is a primary theme of why we're looking at this in today's world, is that, again, I've mentioned these, the concern of the dominant group that there would be a loss of power, prestige, wealth, or resources. And that's really where the conflict or the perception of conflict comes in. And that is, again, another thing that we'll probably see throughout the rest of the book. So I want to thank you for taking a look at this lecture, and I will go ahead and post a lecture for each one of our 5 modules. In the meantime, feel free to, don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. Again, the best way to reach me is either email or telephone, cell phone, probably leaving a message. And I look forward to seeing you online. Thank you.